How many species of living organisms are there on the planet Earth? Some estimate 100 million species, although so far we've only identified 8.7 million. The origin of all this biodiversity is something Charles Darwin referred to as the mystery of mysteries. A major question in evolutionary biology is, how do new species arise? In this video, we'll try to answer this question, but before we do, we first need to understand the definition of species. A famous example of diversity is Darwin's finches. Today, there are 15 species found on the many islands of the Galapagos, and each species is unique. For example, the ground finches feed on seeds on the ground. Others feed on insects and buds. And one has been nicknamed the vampire finch for its habit of drinking blood from the other birds. So how did 15 species arise from a single ancestor? New species arise through speciation, a process where one species splits into two species. This can happen repeatedly to produce many species. So, to evolutionary biologists, a species is an evolutionarily independent population or group of populations. Independent because there is little or no interbreeding between the two separate species. How do two populations become evolutionarily independent? The most common first step is for populations to become separated. One process is called allopatric speciation. This occurs when a geographical barrier prevents members of one population from encountering and mating with members of the other population. Let's look at a couple of examples. Imagine a mainland with an island nearby. A population from the mainland can become separated by dispersal when members of the population disperse to the island and found a new population. For example, imagine a storm blowing a group of finches across the ocean. This is what happened 2.3 million years ago, when an ancestral group of finches flew or were blown from Central or South America to a Galapagos island 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador. Let's go back to our example. The finches have separated into an island population and a mainland population. Over time, the two populations will accumulate differences and diverge from each other. What will cause this to happen? There are 4 mechanisms that can drive genetic divergence. The first is founder effect. This is a random change in allele frequencies from the parent population that occurs when a small founding group establishes a new population. For example, here we see variation in beak size among the finches. Notice that just by chance, the smallest and largest beaked birds did not get blown by the storm. As a result, the island population has less variation in beak size than the mainland population. This difference between the two populations is an example of the founder effect. The second mechanism is genetic drift. This is any change in allele frequencies due to chance events. Let's now focus on the finches on the island. Imagine that on this island there's already a population of Galapagos hawks that can feed on the finches. Shortly after the finches arrive, these hawks eat 2 finches. By chance, they happen to eat 2 finches whose beaks are larger than average. The result is that the average beak size is decreased due to chance events. This is an example of genetic drift. Note that if the island population was large, the death of 2 finches would not have had much effect on the average beak size. But the death of 2 finches had a dramatic effect because this population was so small. The third mechanism is mutation. This is any change in the hereditary material or DNA of an organism. The remaining finches have settled onto the island. Some individuals have died, but new finches are also being produced. In any population, mutations in DNA occur, although they're rare. Some of these mutations create new alleles, and they may alter the phenotype. For example, here we see the emergence of a finch with a novel beak size. The fourth and final mechanism is natural selection. This is the process by which individuals with certain heritable traits tend to produce more surviving offspring than individuals without those traits. This leads to a change in the allele frequency of the population. On the island, the finches find seeds that are different from what they ate on the mainland. Imagine that, on average, the seeds are larger and harder to break open. This gives the birds with the largest beaks an advantage, while many birds with smaller beaks will die out. The larger beaked birds grow more quickly, are more likely to survive, and have more offspring than the smaller beaked birds. Although some small beaked birds will survive and reproduce, they don't produce as many offspring as the larger beaked birds. Since the offspring resemble their parents, over many generations the average beak size will increase. This is an example of evolution by natural selection. We have shown that there are 4 mechanisms that drive genetic divergence between isolated populations: founder effect, genetic drift, mutation, and natural selection. Note that founder effect is a special case of genetic drift because it is also due to chance events. Together, these 4 mechanisms result in differences in average beak size between the finches on the mainland and on the island. Just as birds from the mainland colonized the first island, birds from the first island can also colonize new islands. Again, the finches on the new island evolved through founder effect, genetic drift, mutation, and natural selection. Now that these 2 populations have become quite different from each other, what happens if the isolated finch populations meet again? Well, there are 3 possible outcomes. The first outcome is that they could remain as one species. Let's graph the distribution of beak size for the 2 populations. On the x-axis, we see beak size from small to large, and on the y-axis, we see frequency, meaning how common each beak size is. Notice that the average beak size of each population is different. In this scenario, the birds are able to interbreed and reproduce freely regardless of beak size. On this island, the 2 groups remain as a single species. In the second outcome, the 2 populations are separate species. In this scenario, the average beak sizes of the finches are very different. In fact, many physical and genetic differences have accumulated, and the populations have become different enough that they do not mate with each other. This lack of interbreeding means that speciation has occurred. In the third outcome, speciation is in progress. This is the most interesting outcome. In this scenario, there's limited interbreeding. In other words, large-beaked finches are more likely to mate with members of their own population. The same is true for small-beaked birds. But what happens to birds that don't mate with their own kind? In order to answer this, first we need to think about how the birds use their beaks. Imagine that there are 2 main types of seed on the island, one small and one large. The small-beaked birds can only eat the small seeds. The large-beaked birds are able to crack open and eat the large seeds. They can also eat the small seeds, but are inefficient at eating them. What would happen if birds had medium-sized beaks? They would not be able to open the large seeds. They could only eat the small seeds, but would be outcompeted by the birds with the smaller beaks. This would put them at a fitness disadvantage compared with both the smaller and the larger beaked birds. Let's graph these ideas. The birds in the middle will have lower fitness compared with birds with larger or smaller beaks. In other words, the birds in the middle will be selected against. Selection will favor the birds with the largest and the smallest beaks, and over time this will cause a shift towards the extremes. This type of shift is called character displacement. Let's get back to our original question. What happens to birds that don't mate with their own kind? If large and small beaked birds interbreed, their hybrid offspring will have medium-sized beaks. As we've seen, these will be selected against. This means that parents who interbreed will also have lower fitness. Over time, the 2 populations will diverge and speciation will follow. We've just seen how one dispersal event led to allopatric speciation. This collection of islands makes it easy for many dispersal events to occur, which resulted in many speciation events. Each time speciation is driven by a combination of founder effect, genetic drift, mutations, and natural selection. Dispersal is one way allopatric speciation can occur. Another way is vicariance. Vicariance is the separation of populations that occurs when a habitat is physically split in two. Let's look at a well-studied example of vicariance. Snapping or pistol shrimp are a fascinating group of shrimp named because they have a single large claw that makes a loud snapping sound when it closes, acting as a sonic weapon to stun prey from a distance. Populations of snapping shrimp became isolated 3 million years ago when the Isthmus of Panama rose to separate the Pacific and Caribbean Oceans. This splitting of the habitat divided the shrimp. Unlike the finches, which moved from one habitat to another, the shrimp were separated while staying in the same place. This is an example of vicariance. What happened after these populations became separated? Recall that 4 mechanisms drive genetic divergence: founder effect, genetic drift, mutation, and natural selection. Because both populations are large, founder effect and genetic drift will not have much effect on the snapping shrimp populations. The main factors driving divergence between the two populations will be mutation and natural selection. As with the finches, these two populations evolved differences from each other over 3 million years. Then, in 1914, the Pacific and Caribbean Oceans were rejoined when the Panama Canal was completed. What happened when this geographic barrier was breached? Interestingly, it was observed that the two populations of shrimp snapped at each other aggressively and did not interbreed. This suggested that they had accumulated many differences, and as with the finches, the two populations of snapping shrimp have speciated. Let's review allopatric speciation. A population is split in two through either dispersal or vicariance. The populations accumulate differences through founder effect, genetic drift, mutation, and natural selection. If the populations become sufficiently different, they will no longer interbreed, and at that point, speciation has occurred. Let's return to Darwin's mystery of mysteries. We started by asking, how do new species arise? We have now shown that allopatric speciation is one source of new species. If we add up many speciation events that have occurred over billions of years, the result is the incredible diversity on Earth today.